Characteristics of a good hypothesis. Dear students, we have been discussing the definition of hypothesis and then the importance and functions of hypothesis. And it's now time to discuss that what are those characteristics, what are those attributes which make a hypothesis good and which we must try to formulate for our research studies, right? So these are the characteristics of a good hypothesis. A good hypothesis must be in agreement with the observed facts, right? So whatever, observed facts are available at the time of, the formulation of hypothesis, it must be in agreement, in connection with your hypothesis, right? And there should be no conflict with the universal laws, right? Don't go for any hypothesis which is against any universal law or which is, contradictory to the universal law, any form of universal law, right? So that's the feature of good hypothesis. And a hypothesis must be written in the simplest possible form, right? So that there is no unnecessary complexity involved, right? So it must be written in a very simple way, in the most simple way, right? And a good hypothesis must be permitting to reasoning which are based on deductive mode of thinking. The deductive mode of thinking is when you just try to observe on the basis of a theory, right? And then you hypothesize, and then you observe and collect data, and finally you conclude. So the best hypothesis would be when you go for this mode of thinking, right? The deductive mode of thinking, like started with a model or theory already available with us. And then just on the basis of that theory or model, you are, just hypothesizing and proceeding further, right? So that is another important aspect of a good hypothesis. And a good hypothesis must be with very clear verbalization, right? So whatever wordings you are using, whatever, verbs you are using must be very clear, and there should be no ambiguity, right? So it should be unambiguous, right? Your good hypothesis. And the effective use of tools and techniques available, right, with us at the time of the formulation of hypothesis, they must also be included, right? And the verifications which are subject to be verified subsequently, they must also be, controlled within a hypothesis, right? They must be written in a very clear way, in a very, obvious way, right? So a hypothesis is basically not only ensuring the approachable sample, right? So whatever sample is approachable, your hypothesis would be ensuring that is included, okay? And that would indicate the clear roles of variables, right? Within a hypothesis, we must have some, variables, right? So those variables their roles must be clarified by a good hypothesis. Like, for example, which one is the independent variable, right? And how that independent variable is going to influence the dependent variable, right? So this difference between independent and dependent variable must be clearly, visible in your hypothesis, right? So the role of variables must be there. And then the good hypothesis must be keeping a clear-cut distinction among these, terms, like theory, that what is the theory or the framework, right? What is the background approach, okay? And in the background approach or the theory or framework, we would be, conducting the study, right? Then what law or model we would be using, okay? What principle we would be using, what techniques would be followed, and what are the facts? Facts, the data, right? So a good hypothesis would also be distinguishing among these points, right? And the points related to assumptions and postulates and a hypothesis, right? Like assumptions are those, facts which may or may not be true, which are the conditions, those, restrictive condition which we would be using in our study, right? So assumptions, and then the postulates. Postulates are basically those, assumptions which are stronger and on the basis of which we would proceed, right? Those postulates are basically considered true, right? So a hypothesis would be distinguishing among these terms, these terminologies, and these are the features which must be, indicated by a good hypothesis, right? So a good hypothesis is which give us a clear-cut direction, which clarifies the roles of various variables of the study, and which is not in contradiction to any universal law, right? And which is accepting those facts and those observed information available at the time of the formulation of the hypothesis, and which is open to any deductive mode of thinking, right? So these are the features which must be observed by a good hypothesis.